If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.
I'm happy to welcome everyone to our, I would say, last two wartime lectures after a big break that we've made for January and February for the winter months due to different circumstances. But we will today have a next installment in our series, and may I remind you that we are doing this lecture series together with Alumni Association of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, School for Policy Analysis of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and with the generous support from Justus Liebig University in Gießen. And I'm Anna Osipchuk, I'm Research Director for School for Policy Analysis and alumna of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and I'm very happy to welcome today my fellow alumna of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, Олеся Островська-Люта, who is also the director of Mistecький Arsenal in Kyiv, and she also has been a deputy minister for cultural heritage in 2014. So a lot of topics that we will discuss today. She has a first-hand experience with that, both from more academic side of it, or the curator, and from a policy-making side, I would say, probably. May I also remind that we very much would welcome comments and questions from the audience. So we will have at the end possibility to ask all the questions. So please post your questions in the comment section in YouTube or in the Facebook. And so without further ado, please, Olesya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today, both because this is Kyiv Mohyla Academy who has invited me, and as an alumni, I feel a lot of respect and a lot of sentiment for my old university, but also because I think speaking about cultural heritage and what happens to cultural scene in times of war is extremely relevant right now. If you allow me, I'd start with a short introduction of my institution, where I work right now. It's called Mistecький Arsenal, or in English, it's Art Arsenal. It's one of the biggest Ukrainian, or probably the biggest Ukrainian cultural space and cultural institution. It's enormously huge for any account. It's placed in the very center of old Kyiv, and it used to be our premises were created and built as a part of Kyiv fortress and as an arsenal, old weaponry where weapons were repaired all the time since the end of 18th century until 2005, roughly, when the arsenal building, it's a beautiful, beautiful classicist building, was transformed into a cultural space. And as such, we are still an institution under construction, but we are also a multidisciplinary institution that combines different cultural practices. So we are both a museum holding a collection which consists of three parts. That is Ukrainian avant-garde, Ukrainian contemporary art, and what we call archaeology of the place, meaning the archaeological objects that were excavated on our land. And we also do an extensive program of contemporary art, and we also produced one of the biggest cultural book and literature festivals in Ukraine. It's called the Book Arsenal. It's annual. Therefore, we will also have a literature program, and we also have smaller contributions of performing arts, or we do a lot of intellectual events not focused on a specific cultural practice, multidisciplinary events of all sorts. So that's the institution I work for, and that matters for this lecture, because the title of the lecture is Museums and Art and Culture Spaces in Times of War. So what happens to places such as institution where I work, like the Art Arsenal? And now it's very hard to answer, actually, in Ukraine. What happens to cultural institutions or spaces more generally? Because the situation is very uneven. It's very different in different parts of the country, and it's also very different in time. It changes rapidly and profoundly. Look at the places, like if you look at places such as, let's take an extreme point. Let's look at the places like Mariupol, a place, it's a southern city which was destroyed almost to the rubble by the Russians, but it was a very lively and vivid part of cultural scene of Ukraine until this invasion. So this is one situation, a place that has been destroyed, I'm afraid. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have Western Ukrainian cities such as Uzhhorod, for example, or Chernivtsi, which are, of course, under attack like all the other Ukrainian cities, but the situation is very, very different. Uzhhorod is the only place where you don't have curfew, for example, in Ukraine now. So that also impacts the art scene and how art institutions function right now. If you look at the time scale, you will see the situation changes very much all the time. So you cannot really describe very clearly what happens to an art institution this year, let's say. You can describe what happens this month and sometimes this week. Because if you look at Kyiv, the situation of Kyiv and my institution as well a year ago is extremely different from the situation right now, because a year ago Kyiv was under siege. There was so-called Battle of Kyiv, and you didn't have many residents in Kyiv. There were still people living in Kyiv, but it was less than 1 million people, which is a fraction of what the population of the city is. And this situation was extremely dangerous, because there are three dangers that endanger cultural institutions, just like civil areas in Ukraine. Three major dangers. One is artillery. Second one is air raids, such as missiles, cruise or ballistic missiles. And the third one, probably the worst one, is the enemy forces on the ground occupation. This is what happened to southern parts of Ukraine, and Kyiv was facing all three dangers a year ago. Russian troops were very close to the city, so there were artillery shellings. Missile attacks never stopped, and the Russian troops were quite close to the city. Whilst now you only have one serious threat, that is missile attacks. Why is that important? And missile attacks is the air threat is the reality of every place in Ukraine now. Why is that important? Because this what informs your decisions related to cultural heritage and also to cultural producers. One decision that all the Ukrainian cultural workers had to take through the year 2022 and still have to take is whether to evacuate or do not evacuate. or what institutions should be evacuated, what teams should be evacuated, how it should be done. This is the most profound and fundamental question that is posed every day. Then, as you see, situation in Kiev changed profoundly. The same is true to Chernihiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, but most of all, probably Kherson, the city that was liberated. It was under occupation until autumn, and then you have liberation. But this, the process of occupation also led to massive looting of Kherson museums, and many artifacts were lost. So in that regard, if you try to answer the question, what is the situation in Ukraine in regards to the cultural institution, you would have to answer in such a way that you have to look at Kiev and Chernihiv in March, and then Lviv, Western Ukrainian city, in March. And there were also, look at Lviv, for example. Lviv is one of the cities that have where most of Ukrainians museums, many Ukrainian museums at least, are concentrated. And it was also the city that received the major portion of refugees, including all evacuation trains that were going from east to west. So that city suddenly became a kind of a port city. It's also a city on the Polish border that changed the whole dynamic of what is happening in the city and what happens to its institutions, because cultural institutions suddenly had to transform into institutions receiving refugees, dealing with refugees, and also hosting, kind of receiving refugees and organizing their further trip. Some institutions were receiving refugees, but some were organizing a further trip. So Lviv in March was in a different situation than Lviv now, than Mariupol. Mariupol that really is one of the biggest victims among Ukrainian cities of this war right now. And then Kherson before liberation and Kherson now, situation would be different. Kiev and other places are in different situation now in March 2023 than they were in December 2022, just a few months ago, because as you probably know, in October, energy shortages started because of the missile attacks on Ukrainian electricity grid, and that's essentially important for museums and also other cultural institutions such as music theaters who hold, and libraries who hold different types of heritage and have to provide necessary temperature and humidity regimes. The last few months, the major focus for many cultural institutions around Ukraine were to preserve what's in the hands of those institutions in terms of things as banal as temperature and humidity control, because it's extremely hard to keep stable temperature if you do not have electricity and you don't know how electricity will be provided. So in that sense, what I am trying to describe to you now is that you cannot really describe a situation in static terms and kind of take it as a starting point for your further analysis. The situation is very fluid. It changes all the time. You have to deal with the question whether you have people in certain places to perform certain duties, or you do not, because people are, of course, humans who can flee. And then you do not have people to perform tasks necessary for for protection of cultural institutions. And those situations, people flee and then people return. Those situations will be in constant flux. What you have to understand in war times in regards to cultural institutions, that situation is ever changing, very flexible. You have to start your analysis from this point zero every time you try to analyze things, and you have to build your strategies of protection, of survival, and even of programming, because we do programming even in this situation. For example, my institution, Mistecький Арсеналу, we still receive visitors, and we started to receive visitors as soon as June 2022, after Russian troops retreated, not long after Russian troops retreated. And that is the whole situation is extremely flexible, and you have to take those points into account. Then, having said that this situation needs reassessment on daily basis, and you have to also take into account a few major trends. One is that there is a huge movement of people from one cities to other cities. Think about Kherson and Lviv. People moving from Kherson to safer Lviv. So Lviv has more people and Kherson has less people. But you have cultural institutions, or at least cultural heritage, which cannot be moved in both of those cities. Secondly, think about the heritage protection as a basic, absolutely basic and very direct, simple need, very literary meant, not in abstract terms. And you also have to think that those situations will be changing, and you cannot predict and plan. We're joking here in my institution now that we do not plan anything. We hope for things. We do not plan things. We hope for things. We hope we'll be able to do this and that, because there are so many changing elements of that plan. But having said that, what is the mission of a cultural institution? You still have to think in terms of a mission of cultural institution to be able to function, because that's one of the most important fundamental questions that raise in such situation. And the question is, why do you have to exist as an institution? Why do you have to exist as a cultural space? Do you have to exist at all? And do all the people caring for this place have to risk their health and life to keep it in existence? That's an important question that is one of the prerequisites for your functioning in this situation, and you have to start answering it quite soon, right after you encounter this new situation which war creates. So in this regard, what is the mission of a cultural institution in times of war? And we came up with a number of answers here in Mistecький Арсенал. And what we think is that one of the core and basic missions of every cultural institution, be it an institution which deals with cultural heritage or a contemporary cultural institution, you still have the same element. The basic mission is to protect cultural value. You can call it cultural heritage when it comes to museum objects or historical sites, but it's also often protecting expertise, protecting archives, protecting people working in the field of culture. So it's basically protecting the cultural value, but it's easier, of course, to think about it in terms of cultural heritage. This is the most basic need, which translates into a large mission for an institution. The second one, when you encounter this war situation, the second mission that every cultural worker, not just institutional space, has is amplification of Ukrainian voice on the international arena. What we learned right at the beginning of the war, that speaking up, speaking for yourself, telling your story, describing your situation is vital for you to survive. It's vital to ensure that there is support from your partners. It's vital to have contacts and all sorts of professional grades to be still able to protect this first mission, to protect this cultural value. So amplification of Ukrainian voice is vital. And culture is always about the voice and about the ability to speak, whether directly or in abstract terms, through art, for example, to other humans. That becomes just the prerequisite of survival and for a society, and its cultural institutions and its cultural spaces are doomed to be the agents of this mission. The third one, however, which proved very true and accurate quite soon in our case, is the ability, the mission would be the need to add to the resilience of your society. Because in any situation, you still have people living in your places, in your cities, in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in Chernihiv, in Odessa. In all those places, there are people. It doesn't work like that for situation of deadly threats, such as heavy bombardments, such as Bakhmut or Mariupol, which I have already mentioned. There people need to evacuate, and their institutions too. But those places where people still can have their life, such as Kiev, for example, where I am situated and where our institution works, you suddenly become an important place and an important environment for people to recharge, to actually to build up their resilience. And what are the means of building the resilience? One of the very obvious means or abilities that culture has is to provide a space where people can talk about their experience, where they can either share the experience, but it's not always the case. Sharing is hard. It just sometimes just voicing up your experience, just telling without a more complicated interaction connected to sharing. So this is something that cultural institutions can always do. What we do, except for the situation that are impossible in terms of security. So our very first project in Art Arsenal, right after the Russian retreat, was a large public discussion about our experience as a society, which was called our great movement, in terms, like movement of the people, like Exodus. And we invited writers, historians, philosophers, sociologists to speak about this experience that Ukrainians are going through. We organized it in May 2022, And to make it more ironical, that was this topic, this movement of the people was the topic which was designated for our book festival, the Art Arsenal, which was supposed to take place in May 22. However, we are not able, obviously, to organize a book festival. But the topic, movement of the people, suddenly became even more relevant to Ukrainian experience than it was a year prior to the festival when we came up with this topic. So we gathered, we invited just our visitors to come and talk about it. And we were very surprised that there was a very large attendance and people suddenly wanted to come together to listen to reflections, to share their reflections, and to stay together, to be together. This is something that a cultural space is capable of, creating this possibility to share, to speak, to be together, and to feel other people. The next thing we did as our mission to add to the resilience of the society was an exhibition that we opened in June. It was an exhibition based on contemporary art and partly our collection of artworks. And the topic, we called it, we didn't know how to call it, so we called it an exhibition about our feelings, because it was exactly what it was. It was trying to speak about what we feel, what we've been through with the help of art. And those were not newly produced works, but rather works from the collections, which you read in a different way after a certain experience. And it was very well received, very popular. And there was one funny story on that exhibition. When we open exhibitions, we usually have curatorial tours on weekends, where curators of our exhibitions kind of guide the visitors and tell about the exhibition. So we did the same with this exhibition about our feelings, and the curator of this exhibition, Olga Melnik, she gave a tour to the many visitors of the Art Arsenal on the first weekend after the exhibition started. And after she finished, the tour took some 30 or 40 minutes. But after she finished, she went out to have some fresh air in the yard. And the people, the visitors who listened to her giving the tour, came out of the gallery with her. And they started to tell her their stories. They were so much engaged about what they saw, how it resonated with them, that they started to participate in a very direct and active way. And I see it as one of those, as a signs that this mission works. When you create a space where people can interact and speak, and if people genuinely react to it, that means that this works. And this is something that was needed. And that brings us to the fourth mission of a cultural institution or a space, if you like, or larger collective as well, in times of war. What is one of the most, the hardest things to do in times of crisis? When you are endangered, it's extremely hard to think in abstract terms, and it's extremely hard to imagine the future, to imagine a different scenario, to work on the side of self-reflection. It's very hard to reflect about the situation you are in. It's even harder to reflect about something which is not in close proximity to your sometimes body, to yourself, which is not your experience here and now. And that is culture. Culture is one of the very few means that help you to practice reflection and self-reflection nevertheless, even in situations such as such as deadly threat that you are being faced with. And once again, let me speak from our experience, how we worked with that. Just the other week, we closed down an exhibition which we opened at the end of November. And the end of November was an extremely challenging time for Ukraine, because this is when Russians started their missile campaign against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. They targeted electricity grid, and therefore you didn't have electricity. And how do you show an art exhibition without lighting and without heating? That's one of the most interesting and challenging tasks too. However, even in such situation, we opened this exhibition which we called Heart of Earth, and it's a contemporary art exhibition, an exhibition that reflects the triangle between land or earth, a human, and food. And food is brought as a result of interaction between a human and earth. So food suddenly became very important element in the Russian war against Ukraine, because the global food security turned out to be very fragile and threatened, and implications of this war here are felt very far away from Ukraine in the countries, often in the countries of global south, for example. And those are the same countries that really suffer from the global warming. Well, on the other hand, what Ukraine is facing at the moment is extreme mining of Ukrainian lands. There are mines in thousands. Ukraine is the most mined territory in the world right now. So this pollution with mines, with chemicals as a result of battles, with also sorts of machinery is extremely dangerous too, because a human cannot farm on this land any longer in the same volumes, which leads to really hard implications, to really deadly threats, not for the human that lives on this earth only, but also for many humans in many countries that are already endangered for different reasons. So it's something which puts a certain place, a certain land, and people on this land in a much more central position that they could have imagined. And anything that happens here has huge implications in other places. So we tried to create an exhibition on that, not only to think about what happens to us here and now, but also what happened to us as a community and as a geographical entity, as an environmental entity historically. Think of Chernobyl, for example, and other, as we call it, examples of environmental violence. To think of it historically, but also think of it widely geographically. What happens globally as a result of this war? It's harder to reflect on that in everyday life, but art can do that. Art can be this tool, mean, an environment that helps people reflect about larger implications, about greater ideas too. So that's the fourth mission of an institution in war, trying to reflecting on what's going on with the world where human lives. But now let me be a little bit more, a little bit less theoretical, and speak about more about what happened, also what we also saw as as direct and immediate results of the war on Ukrainian institutions. One thing is, of course, destruction. Many things were destructed. Many cultural workers fled abroad. Many of them are women. Well, cultural field in Ukraine is mostly populated by women, just like in many other countries. And many women had to make extreme choices, either stay in Ukraine and work for the institution, society, you name it, or protect their children and take their children to safer places. This is an impossible choice. And sometimes you really don't have a choice when you are faced with a situation like that, which led to large numbers of Ukrainian creators fleeing the country. And it has two double effect. In one way, there is one you could call it a positive effect to extent, and that is it's connected to this second mission that I mentioned, amplification of Ukrainian voice on international area, because those cultural workers who fled, they are volens nolens ambassadors of their culture, because they tell people about their culture, they interact with people on everyday basis, and that makes Ukrainian less strange, less exotic, which of course help for building better relations with other societies in the future. But the second thing is that you lack those creative minds that can reflect, perform that fourth mission in Ukraine. And there is also a very, very practical thing that happens in such a situation. You suddenly, as an institution or a collective, you are limited in your programming, in performing your mission in terms that you have less access to artworks. Because when it comes to a text, someone writes a text and publishes a text, it's a very abstract, virtual environment and tool, creative tool, right? But when it comes, when it's a visual artwork, a painting, graphic artwork, sculpture, installation, they are physical objects. So they need to be protected for one part, and for other part, they would be they leave the country together with their creators. So it's much harder for a society to build its own cultural archives, its museum collection for the future. So what we are facing as a society right now, Ukrainian society, we might have much less access to our future cultural heritage than we would have in a normal situation, because it's much harder to bring the artworks in Ukraine now, to purchase them to museum collections. This is something that happened to Ukraine in the 90s. If you look at Ukrainian museum collections, we hardly have any art of the 90s in museum collections. For that reason, museums did not purchase artworks at that time. Artists didn't think about their artworks as valuable objects for the future, and much was produced on very cheap materials, which are very hard to preserve now. And we just, as a professional community in Ukraine, we've just started to reflect on that situation. And now we are facing a similar future threat with the situation now, because of the risk of physical destruction of those objects, of those artworks. And there is also one more strategist that artists are using. You have to remember that artists are citizens of Ukraine, of course, so they want to be a part of resistance in every way a citizen can be. not only reflecting, not only creating about the situation of a human being, but also as simple as donating to Ukrainian army or to civilian causes. So let me just give you a few examples. On our exhibition, which I mentioned, The Heart of Earth, this exhibition about environment and food and human, there were beautiful, beautiful artworks by Жанна Кадирова. And Жанна Кадирова works with solid materials and she creates sculpture. What she did this year, or the year 2022, she started a series of artworks called Паляниця. And Паляниця in Ukrainian is a bread loaf, and it's an important word in Ukrainian folklore, war folklore, because there is a popular meme and a joke that a Russian cannot pronounce Ukrainian word Паляниця. Therefore, it's a test word to find out whether you are dealing with a Russian saboteurs or Ukrainian military. So this artwork that Жанна created in 2022 is called Паляниця, and it's made of river stones in Zakarpattia region. It's a region near Uzhhorod, near the far western border, where it's close to Carpathian Mountains, and you have Carpathian mountain rivers there with beautiful stones. So Жанна collects the stones and cuts them as if they are bread loaves. They look just like a bread loaf, very, very similar, but you know it's a stone. It's a extremely beautiful artwork, and you can find many images on the internet if you are interested. So what Жанна does, what's her strategy? She sells those artworks in really large numbers to international foreign galleries and private collectioners to fundraise for Ukrainian army. All the money she gets from those artworks, she donates to Ukrainian army, and she's donated many millions now. I don't know the exact figure right now, but 4 months ago it was about 6 million hryvnias. It's about $130,000 US. That's one strategy. Another artist, Mikita Kadan, the artist of the same generation as Жанна Кадирова, in their late 30s, early 40s, he does just the same. He sold the 2 artworks that he specially produced for our exhibition as a part of his donation to Ukrainian military. Or another case is Alevtina Kahidze, an extremely interesting artist who stayed through the Battle of Kiev next to Kiev in her house in Muzichi village near Kiev, and she produced an extremely impressive graphic diary of living in very close proximity to aggressor. So Alevtina also works and donates to many causes. One of those that I know quite well is she donated to an organization called Children Town SOS, and this is an organization helping to evacuate children and protect children affected by war. So artists are also doing their work as artists, reflecting, trying to describe the situation of a human, but also as, in a very direct sense, as citizens. One of the things that I noticed, and we shared those impressions with my colleagues, is that there is merge of the border between fiction and real life, where some real life scenes become represented as artworks, and artworks are really an actor in the real life in the way that I have described to you just now. I think I've been talking for 45 minutes now. I think I will stop now and here, and I'd be happy to answer your questions if there are any.
Yeah, I thank you very much, Olesya. I invite our audience to please post your questions in comment section if you have any comments on Facebook or on YouTube. Also, first I have several reactions and questions. I think one of the things that I actually think it's very important, and I'm as a sociologist who also do a bit into sociology of culture. I think this notion about culture is always about the voice and the ability to speak, and in this way, culture being and Ukrainian culture being something that it's about Ukrainian voice and amplifies Ukrainian voice in the international arena. I think that is something that very resonates with me and with my understanding and reading, and I think it's a very important message of what culture is about, especially I think sometimes we very much limit culture just to the art, but what you talked now is still it's much more than just the art. Although it is also about art also, and I also wanted you mentioned Aleftina Khakidze's work, and I remember her series on about her mother and strawberries. It's been one of the, I think, like one of the high marks or highlights of how what we remember when we think about past 8 years before the full-scale invasion happened, about occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, these regions, and I think it's. But it brings me back to probably one of the questions. Obviously, there's a diary that, or in an art form, that for her, first of all, I would assume, help her to reflect, and then for us to reflect with her and to remember that and to react in some way and to commemorate. But it's also done in a very fragile form that is hard to preserve. And so, and I would refer to what you mentioned about the problem of when you talked about the art objects from 90s and the art scene and art life of 90s, and the fact that a lot of that has been produced in this very vibrant years and in the vibrant art scene, actually we do not have a lot of that preserved in our museums. Do you think that actually the question of preserving the art that's been created now in this past year and probably even a bit earlier, since the war started, regarding with the occupation of Crimea and Donbass, do you think that will be a big challenge to preserve these art objects, and what could be done to actually help to preserve these different art objects in different forms?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It was actually one of the central questions for many curators and art practitioners right at the beginning of the war. And let me tell you about one initiative which was started by my colleague Natasha Chechasova. She's a young curator. She's also the head of contemporary art division in the Art Arsenal. And what Natasha did, she was the person who felt the necessity of preservation immediately, because also perhaps because of her personal story, if I may, because Natasha was displaced. She is originally from Donetsk. She had to flee Donetsk in 2014, and then she also had to flee Kiev in 2022. And when she found herself near Lviv in spring 2022, she thought that she will start collecting and archiving any art, any valuable art reflection on the war, not just the full-scale invasion, but earlier part of the war. So she started it first as a curator, but also a private or a citizen just in her computer in March. But quite soon she proposed it as a wider project to the Arsenal, where she still worked, and we developed it as a project which is called Ukraine Ablaze, and that is basically an archive of images of the artworks, not the artworks themselves, because they are in very, very different places, but it's documenting documentation about art reflection and art production connected to the war. It's not the only initiative. There was one more initiative, at least, that I'm well aware of. It's connected to so-called NGO Museum of Contemporary Art, and they did just the same, but they also preserved some physical, some amount of physical artwork. At the moment, we are working on a new exhibition to start in April this year, I hope. And the exhibition is focused exactly on what you, Anna, have mentioned. You said that some artworks were created on very fragile materials, and they are hard to preserve. This is what my colleagues from the Department of Contemporary Art noticed. And many artists, since the full-scale invasion, many artists changed their media, just often for practical, sometimes symbolical reasons. I described the artwork, the sculptures by Zhanna Kadyrova. Zhanna started using the river stone because she lived near the river where there were those stones when she fled Kiev. Many artists changed, let's say, from oil paintings to graphics on paper, just because it's much easier to transport and sometimes to produce things on paper. Or some started to use textile because it was just in their reach. And there is a beautiful practice by Katya Buchatska, a Kiev-based artist, who found out that she cannot use paints any longer because the oil paints, which Ukrainian artists often use, they were produced in Russia. So you can't use them for a number of reasons, ranging from moral to simply economical and practical. And what Katya Buchatska started to do, she started to produce her own paint based on earth. Therefore, she has abstract paintings called Moshchun, the red Moshchun, because she collected the earth in those plundered places near Kiev. Or she also she has a beautiful painting called Hostomelska Chervona. It's based. The paint was based on the earth she collected in Hostomel near Kiev, and Hostomel was one of the first places to be invaded by Russian air forces, unsuccessfully, luckily. So that the war situation impacts art media profoundly, and my colleagues, especially Natasha Chichasova, whom I already mentioned, they work on an exhibition to reveal just that, how media as the derivates, in a sense, from the situation of war.
If I may, to probably continue on a related matter, I mean, sometimes it's the discussion what is art is I mean, it's a bit probably a bit of philosophical this question, what if we may say. But for example, to refer about all artifacts that have been created within this year after the full-scale invasion, sometimes it's easy to recognize on some level that it's the art. Like we can see, for example, Banksy's picture, and a lot of people recognize immediately that it's the art. But sometimes there is a clear intention of the creator. It is created with artistic purpose or with reflection. How we say that everything that is created as art is art. But sometimes it could be probably not that obvious what should be preserved, or what should, like, if there is some graffiti or some mural, does it have artistic value to preserve, or if there is some object, what do you think about this decision of what should be preserved or not, especially if the intention of the artist, of the creator, is probably could not be obvious in some cases?
Well, I think this is a process. This decision, what should be presented, what should not preserved, what should not, is a process, and will be different in different historical moments. Some objects that used to be seen as let's say, objects or spiritual objects, right, are perceived today as purely museum objects. So they are eliminated from the spiritual use to an extent. What do you do with churches? There is an ongoing debate about Sofia Kievska, Ukraine's probably the most precious medieval building. Should it be used for religious worship or not? It's not something which can be decided once and forever. So the decision would be, it's a subject to change based on the historical situation and consensus in the society. There might be a different situation, position, and different, artists and professionals might look differently on an artwork. You probably meant, when you were asking this question, I think you meant the notorious case of Banksy in Bucha. Should it be preserved as a valuable museum object, or just left on the ruins? I'm one of those who would think it should be left by the ruins to the maximum of artistic effect. On the other hand, this judgment is not final. I think that we again are dealing with a fluid situation where professional judgments will change depending on some factors.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. It's one of the cases, and I, in one of the discussions with my students, we have discussion about I'm sorry. I guess I was interrupted a bit, so I apologize. We had a discussion whether there was this example of ruined buildings in Borodanka. I think this multi-story building with a hall in the middle, and we had a very interesting debate with students whether it should be preserved or not. The building itself, not necessarily artistic object, but certainly a commemorative place, and I don't think we reached any decision even in our debate. So I see what you mean by saying that it's a debate. in protest.
Well, the most notorious case about preservation of ruins that I can think about, which is relevant to our situation, is a preservation decision by citizens of Serbia in Belgrade and near Belgrade to preserve untouched those buildings that were bombed by NATO air forces more than 20 years ago. As I saw them myself in 2001, and they were standing like that for a number of years by that time, which seemed strange back then. Even you understand the commemorative power of it. However, it now arises the question: how many objects? Which objects? What's the purpose of commemoration? What's the consensus in the society around this commemoration? And I hear that many of those Serbian objects are still preserved as they were more than 20 years ago. I do not have a clear decision about that. A clear thought. Sometimes I understand the commemorative power of the objects. On the other hand, I don't know if those practices are always measured against social cohesion situation. So I'm rather on that side that this has to be a very careful process, and that this process is not final until something is ruined to the scratch or rebuilt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly understand that. We have some questions, but please, if I may remind everyone to please post your questions. We will come to the questions soon. Oh well, we can do that now. So this is, I will read it. What should the Ukrainian authorities do with the citizens who don't necessarily have Russian political views, but were grown up but grow up in the Russian culture and do not see any threat in Russian culture? That's a bit of a change from our topic, but still relevant. Please, if you have any answer.
Well, first of all, I don't think Ukrainian authorities should do anything with those citizens, since we are trying not to be an authoritarian state, which tells you what to think and what to feel and what not to think. So I'd be extremely cautious with this formula. But if we put it in another way, what should Ukrainian institutions, not necessarily authorities, but both public and private and civil society institutions do to reach social cohesion? That's another question. And there you can build your programming. For example, you would prioritize, I would recommend it, prioritize publishing in Ukrainian language than Russian language. Let me be blunt in this situation. Or I would try to purchase books by Ukrainian publishers to Ukrainian libraries and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this answer. About this publishing of the books resonates very much, especially as someone who works in a university and needs to, have this reading list to give students, and sometimes you just can't find these books translated, necessary books translated into Ukrainian language, for example, that you should, especially like philosophy or social science classics.
Or if you need to read Dostoevsky novel for the needs of the class. No, we should not go into full absurd on that. Depends. What we have to measure, I think we have to measure our steps against the purpose. What's the purpose, and whether it helps us to achieve the purpose or it doesn't. And so there, the most important exercise is to clearly define the purpose, probably.
Mm-hmm. My microphone. But I think it's probably on a question that is connected to that, but also connected to this Ukrainian voice on international arena, and to also museum practices. How do you think is important, or are we really in the start of the process of possible reattribution and reappropriation of Ukrainian cultural figures, or different figures into Ukrainian culture? You know, these discussions, because, for example, in Spain, I think there's been this exhibition of in Madrid, I think, of Ukrainian avant-garde that will be moving through some other European cities, which presents presents works of a lot of figures who for years has been associated with Russian avant-garde and not or Ukrainian or so.
Well, I think it's for the first time in history we have an opening from the part of institutions in other countries to listen to Ukrainian voice and to have a fair discussion about Ukrainian culture, cultural figures, and contribution of Ukrainian society to international cultural scene. There is and many, as you see, many institutions have been willing to engage in this debate and change many attributions in their collections. However, this is just a superficial process. The most important process is academic process, analytical process, where you have profound academic research underpinning such discussions. And that process is just starting. We are not there yet at all. It's not enough to change a caption next to the painting. There has to be a professional consensus based on research, based on arguments, and that takes time. And there we are in both better position and weak position. It's better because there is much more interest in other countries and much more will to fund some research in other countries. But the weakness of our situation is that basically Ukrainian society, who should be the major sponsor of such research, in good sense, meaning Ukrainian universities should do that, Ukrainian academic institutions. But Ukrainian society is really weak in terms of financial sustainability right now, and academic research is really not the top priority against purchase of weapons. So I am both cautiously optimistic and deeply pessimist on that issue.
Yeah, I totally can understand about the lack of financing in academia and especially on academic research that doesn't give you immediate gains in some sphere. But probably here, if because I can see here, apart from academic institution, probably a place for a clear role and agency of cultural institutions within Ukraine. So that is probably should it also be one of their mission to actually.
Oh, it is. It is. That's what those institutions do, but they are exactly in the same situation. Every institution goes on certain resources. right? They are both financial and human. However, we might hate the very term. They are also those are time resources. You need to have time to do your research. It's not the case with us. So we are in a situation of very, very scarce resources, and the situation is much worse than it was even a year ago, because any resources accumulated when it comes to money, simple as that were used through the first year of the war. And now economy is not working that well to bridge those shortages. We have a joke here in Arsenal that we are in the 90s again. In the 90s, there was just, when it comes to culture, there was just one source of support, and that was international donors. And international donors did not support culture. They supported something else. So people were very creative, finding ways to kind of fit in. Therefore, you had organizations working with to strengthen democracy through culture and things like that. And unfortunately, that's the case once again. We are not able to generate income to fund Ukraine by ourselves, be it a cinema producer or a museum or a concert hall. It's just impossible under current situation. You do not have business and private donors who have resources that can be invested into something more abstract than survival. That's why many of them support army, because it's a very immediate and necessary need for all of us, right? Mm-hmm. And then you don't have a state that would have resources for that. And the only source which is still stable is, I'm afraid, international donors once again, who do not fund culture. So it's going to be hard, both for academia and culture in the next years.
Yeah, but it simply depends on how long the war will last, and
exactly
after
what happens to our economy, course of it and after the war. So this is one thing that you have to learn as a cultural practitioner very early in your life, that culture is very much dependent on the resources generated elsewhere. Mm-hmm. You need to have a vibrant economy to also have vibrant cultural institutions, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Probably I see that as a connected topic, but it's not directly connected. You mentioned in the beginning of your lecture this looting from Ukrainian museums and cultural institutions and the ruination of many museum and institutions. Would you? How optimistic would you be about Ukraine getting back what has been looted, or even?
It depends how war goes. If we, as a country and a society and a state, if, for example, we can liberate Crimea, there is a good chance that the museum collections that were looted in Kherson and Central Crimea would be still there. But if they go in Russia and there is no profound transformation inside Russia, it's going to be next to impossible. We've been trying to return many of our museum objects or archive collections for the past 100 years with very little success. A lot of Ukrainian heritage, including political archives such as Ukrainian National Republic and other archives, were sent to Russia. more than 100 years ago or 100 years ago, they're still there. So it's not a process which only happens in culture or in academia. It's a deeply political, and in our case, even military process.
Yeah, and related to that, because, for example, I in one of the discussion on a totally different matter, not about culture, but about future model of relations with like the models for the end of the war and Russia's future. We have one of the comments made has been that any questions about, for example, restitutions or any questions about returning of things should be put into on the table during negotiations. Do you think it might happen that either? Do you think? My question is, like, as to you as someone who works in a cultural institution in Ukraine, either within the community a will to pressure or to influence decision makers to actually not forget this question when they will be a point for negotiations of any kind?
Well, certainly. But there is also a very strong understanding, I guess, that this is not these are the steps that cannot be taken on the cultural scene. What culture can do, what culture is good in, is raising the voice, right? Voicing certain questions. That's certainly possible, and that's certainly on the radars. But when it comes to actual process of restitution, it's pretty much, as I said, a military and political process.
But is someone actually working with politicians here from cultural side? Do you think?
If you look at the new document that was just published, just recently called Memorandum on Lasting Peace by Ukrainian intellectuals, there is mention of culture there, mostly in forms of UNESCO and international representation of Russia, but there was a lot of discussion behind even that scarce mentioning. So there is understanding about it. It's actually, I've been working on the cultural field professionally for more than 20 years, actually 25, 26 years, just some time. It's not 50 years, but still a few decades, right? And cultural voice has never been as strong as now. Mm-hmm. It was very strong at the beginning, at the turn of 90s and 80s, when the politicians, if you remember who was in the politics, those were the same people who were writers, poets, theater directors. They were all in the parliament, and those were the people who drafted Declaration of Independence. It was the high moment of influence of this cultural scene. Then it really went down, and it's the next time, I guess, when this thinking even related to culture and academia as well, actually, is gaining any attention.
Mm-hmm. I do not have such experience, but I do think I noted that, and I think that partly probably that is, you mentioned the role of culture in resilience and the mutual connection, and probably that's culture. Yeah, please.
I think it's pretty much connected to specific individuals, mm-hmm. And who's speaking from the part of culture, and what is their social standing, and are any of those people the model of success in any sense? That is deeply intertwined. If a cultural figure, abstract cultural figure, is not a model of social success, the voice will not be heard and any message will not get into a political process. And that has changed quite a bit recently, which I see as a very good process.
Yeah. We have a comment rather than a question. It's I'll read the Project Ukraine in English. Ukraine is a vivid example of documenting, preserving, and promoting the Ukrainian art. Among other things they do, it's mostly photos and design items that they collect and promote. I admire these guys for their doer attitude.
They are great. They are great practitioners. Actually, my deputy Marian Manько is also the one who's in charge of how do you call it, partnerships, right, in the Ukraine. So some people wear just many hats, but Ukraine and Bogdan Logvinenko and his team, they are absolutely great promoters, and they do a great job.
Yeah, I guess that's a good illustration for this Ukrainian voice on the international arena, especially, but not only international. That's also, I wouldn't actually omit their role within Ukraine and opening or making us know about other.
But Bogdan Logvinenko, you also, it's a very interesting also topic to talk about. He's a big dreamer, and that's a good example how important it is sometimes to be a practical dreamer. Because when I first met Bogdan, it was about 15 years ago or something, and he was dreaming about creating a Ukrainian social media, kind of Ukrainian Facebook, as we joke now. And he was taking practical steps as well towards that. So he's the man who has ideas and persistence to reach his goals, and I admire that very much.
Yeah, and I guess it also goes back to that in the time of a change, a drastic change, these great dreamers and figures of culture become the men of ideas, and women with ideas become, their roles become most profound and important. I thank you very much for this talk, this lecture, and your answers to my questions and to our audience questions. Thank you very much, and I thank all the audience, and we'll meet next week for the final talk within our wartime series, wartime lecture series, at least for the first season. We'll see how it goes then. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.
Oops.